10K.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Neo Geo review here on Player One Start. Previously in this series, we took a look at the hardware, tech specs, launch, as well as the fighting and beat-em-up games on the system. In this video, we're going to dive into the run-and-gun and shooter games that were available on the console, and I will showcase a few that were exclusive to the MVS and arcades. There are a lot of titles to get through, so I'll just remind you to click subscribe and the bell icon to be notified when I make future posts in this series, and we'll get started. I've already covered the Metal Slug series in its own review video, as I really do feel like that is the premier franchise on this console in terms of run-and-gun shooter games. Out of all of the games that I played in this series, I really didn't find a bad one in the bunch. The graphics and sound and art direction of this game really do stand out, and I think they are just very well-made games that have stood the test of time better than some of the other games released during this time period. Looking back on it, I think my only criticism was that if I played them all in a row, I did get a little bit of franchise fatigue. The only tragedy about this series is that it is incredibly expensive to collect for the Neo Geo. Thankfully, it has been re-released several times, and I would definitely recommend picking this up on any modern console as a digital title, but I am also happy to have a physical copy for my PlayStation 2 and PSP. If you want to see more about each of the individual games, I recommend going back and watching my Metal Slug review series, as I dive into them in great detail.
Ninja, Commando.
Ninja Commando is a vertically scrolling run-and-gun shooter video game developed by Alpha Denshi and published by SNK. It was first released for the Neo Geo in 1992, and it was released for the Neo Geo CD in 1994. In this game, you choose between one of 3 ninja characters that are all part of an elite group of ninja commandos. Each character has a different background and differing abilities. Your goal in this game is to stop the main villain and his Mars Corporation from using a time machine to destroy the past and control the future. This will have you fighting in several different locations around the world during different time periods. In terms of gameplay, I kept getting vibes from games like Akari Warriors, as you are constantly battling from this top-down perspective. And as usual, you just fight your way through the entire level until you reach a boss at the end of the stage. Do that enough times and you have beaten the game. When this game was released, I've seen it get review scores between 7 and 9 out of 10, with my overall experience being around a 6 or a 7 out of 10. I enjoyed the tight controlled gameplay as well as the visuals and the music, but overall to me something just felt kind of generic about this game. So for me there's nothing remarkable about this title, but if you're a fan of the genre, I think you'll find this title at least a little entertaining. Shock Troopers is another run-and-gun arcade game, this time developed by Saurus and published by SNK in 1997. In this game, you take control of one of 3 soldiers on a mission to save a scientist and his granddaughter, who are kidnapped in order for an evil organization to gain control over a powerful drug that turns people into superhuman soldiers. You get to choose at the beginning of the game whether you're going to attempt the game as a Lonely Wolf or in team battle. In Lonely Wolf, one character is controlled throughout the entire game, while in team battle you're allowed to select from a band of 3 soldiers throughout the missions, being able to switch between them on the fly. Each character has their own stats. For example, some might start with a higher life bar, while others can move faster. One thing I like about this game is that you're able to shoot in all 8 different directions, which is a blessing in this game because danger is usually coming in all directions. Something key to your playthrough as well is that if you hold down the fire button while moving, you will continue firing in that direction and begin strafing. I'm sure this was mentioned in how to play the game, but I actually discovered this by accident while I was playing, and that became a game saver. Again, nothing really changes. You have to go through each level, fighting a boss at the end, for a total of 7 levels. And in terms of game reviews, I've seen this score quite well, with critics being around an 8 or a 9 out of 10, and with my initial playthrough, I would rank it at about an 8 out of 10. I found this title a bit more fun than Ninja Commandos, and I found this one a bit hard to put down, especially being a fan of run-and-gun shooters from the arcades of this time period.
We must stop these RC. They have only 72 hours to accomplish their objectives. The 4 specialists will exterminate the troops of DSC. They will never be defeated. Shock Troopers, Second Squad.
A sequel was released in 1998 for the Neo Geo. However, despite being made by the same development company, it is listed as having no connection with the first Shock Troopers game. The gameplay system has been changed drastically, as there are only 4 players that are selectable, and there is no team mode available as from the first Shock Troopers. This game relies more heavily on pre-rendered sprites, and you're allowed to hop in some vehicles throughout the game, reminding me a little bit of Metal Slug. This game was not as well reviewed as the original, but I think that is solely due to the fact that this is a sequel to Shock Troopers, but it doesn't really feel like it. I agree with the reviews that mention if you judge this game as being a standalone title, it is definitely excellent and holds its own weight, but when comparing it to the other title, this one just comes up a bit short. I would still give it a rating of about 8 out of 10, definitely something that I enjoyed, and I think a lot of people would find enjoyment out of this game as well. Sonic Wings 2, which was released overseas as Aero Fighters 2, is a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up arcade game released in 1994 by Video System and published by SNK. It would be released for the Neo Geo CD that same year. In this game, you get to jump into the cockpit of an aircraft that is determined by which character you choose and country on the selection screen. You fight through each vertically scrolling level, playing with 2 buttons. The A button fires projectiles from the plane, and the B button launches your special bomb attack from a limited stock of bombs. You can upgrade your weapons by collecting power-ups along the way. When certain ground enemies or buildings are destroyed, money bonuses will appear, which give a set number of points based on how fast you destroy them and how quickly you collect the bonus. In my experience, though, these are usually a trap, so I would recommend ignoring them unless you're really trying to bump up your high score. When you reach the end of a stage, you have to face off against a boss ship. Do this about 10 times, and you will beat the game. Once you beat the game, depending on the character you select, there is a different ending. Then, in true arcade fashion, the game just starts over again, this time with swapping out the color palette, but if you beat the game this time, the game will truly end. This game has been met with positive reception from reviewers and critics since its release, and even in modern reviews, and I would say that I enjoyed it as well. I didn't really find it too remarkable, but I give it about an 8 out of 10. If you like that game, you will probably like Aero Fighters 3, which was released the following year in 1995, still developed by Video System. Strangely, the home port of the AES version did not make it overseas, but the MVS and Neo Geo CD versions did. This game expands the total stage count to 18, of which 8 will be played in each of the game's 2 loops using a branching system, allowing you to choose your own path. Upon its release, this game was met with more mixed reception from critics. Some reviewers praised the intense action and the audio soundtrack, but some said that the gameplay was not as fresh and definitely not as fun as Aero Fighters 2. And although I'm thinking around those same lines, I would definitely say this game is a 7 out of 10. It plays well, it kind of feels like more of the same from Aero Fighters 2 in my opinion, so if you like that game, you'll like this one even more, but if you're going to play just one, I would start out with the second one. Andro Dunos is a scrolling shooter video game that was developed by Visco Corporation and published by SNK in 1992. The game takes place in a futuristic sci-fi setting where an unknown alien race from outer space, as opposed to alien races not from outer space, have begun an invasion. You, as the player, take control of a space fighter craft in a last-ditch effort for mankind to overthrow the alien forces. A notable feature of this game is the ability to choose between 4 different weapon sets at any time in a linear order by pressing the B button. Each weapon can be powered up multiple times from the original state, and you can hold down the fire button to charge up your weapon for a very powerful shot against the enemies. However, doing so will downgrade your weapon to the previous power level. Taking a hit will cause your craft to be destroyed, and when you respawn, your weapons also will be downgraded 1 level. Since its release, this game has received more of a mixed reception than its contemporaries, but for my experience, this is a game that I was told by several people before starting this review that I had to include in the Ultimate Neo Geo review. I did enjoy this game, but really felt like it was more of a 7 out of 10 kind of title. Again, it's very competently made, nothing game-breaking, but there's nothing remarkable to make it an excellent experience for me. Pulstar is a 1995 horizontal scrolling shooter video game that was published by SNK, but developed by ACOM. In this game, players control a starship in its mission to eradicate the solar system of a hostile race of aliens that threaten mankind. And immediately into jumping into the game, you may get some serious R-Type vibes, and that was something that I definitely saw when I first played through this as well. But what makes this game stand out the most to me are the unique pre-rendered visuals. This was around the time that pre-rendered visuals were becoming very popular with game developers as a trick to make their systems look like they were doing better things than they were really capable of. And unlike other games that use pre-rendered visuals, these hold up quite well in my opinion. Combine that with a soundtrack that sounds almost unlike anything else on the Neo Geo, using more samples than synthesis, and I think that makes this game really stand out. So even though this game looks and sounds great, how does it play? Well, as I said before, it definitely gives me some strong R-Type vibes, and I'm a huge fan of that series. There are 8 stages that you automatically scroll through, and at the end of the stage, after you've defeated all the enemies, you face off against a boss. Throughout the levels, you're able to acquire an auxiliary drone, similar to what you would see in R-Type, allowing you to use it as a battering ram against smaller enemies, and using it as a shield against projectiles. You collect power-ups which upgrade your weapon, and of course using the auxiliary drone allows you to have special fire-powered attacks. This game received a mixed to positive reception from critics when it was released, but most of the positive reviews of this game really mention the fact that SNK was finally starting to branch out of versus fighter games. The pre-rendered graphics and sound were also mentioned as 2 of the top game's selling points, but when it came down to gameplay, many felt that it was unimpressive. Some mentioned that during some parts of the game, the enemies and projectiles blended too easily into the background, and others mentioned that it was at a much slower pace than they were expecting for a game of this caliber. Overall, I consider this game to be a very admirable attempt to create a game that was among the high caliber standards that R-Type was setting in the market. But I think if I describe this game in one word, it would be the word almost. The game is almost great. It's hard to explain unless you are actually playing the game, but when you start playing it, you're very quickly realizing that there's just something missing out of the gameplay element that's keeping it from being a standout, excellent title. As such, I would give it around an 8 out of 10, but thankfully they released a sequel. Blazing Star is the sequel to Pulstar, and it was developed by the same team, but they had changed their name from ACOM to Yamkobo. The game features gameplay that is very similar to its predecessor, with a story that revolves somewhat around cyborgs and artificial intelligence. Pretty sure you can fill in the blanks from there. And in my opinion, this is the game they got right. I really feel like this game is just a very polished version of Pulstar. The graphics look a little bit more polished, the gameplay is better, and I didn't really feel like the arcade unfair difficulty was as strong with this one. In terms of other people's reviews though, some people feel that Pulstar is the better one, and some people feel that Blazing Star is the better one. Review scores of this were kind of all over the map back in the day, usually giving around an 8 or 9 out of 10, but with most of the reviews being critical of the fact that by the time this game was released, the shoot-'em-up genre was on its way out. If you had to choose just one of these, I would say Blazing Star is my recommendation, but both of them I think provide a good time for a little bit different reason. Going back to the earlier shoot-'em-ups on the console, Last Resort is an arcade shoot-'em-up game that was released by SNK in 1992. And this game is perhaps the earliest example of SNK trying to copy the R-Type formula. And as such, the gameplay is just about the same as the other games I've mentioned. There are 5 stages that you will loop through twice to get through the end of the game, And along the way you're able to acquire an auxiliary drone that does all the same things you would expect it to do as you defeat the enemies in each stage and each stage's boss. Since its release, the game received around 8 or 9 out of 10 from reviewers, with them praising the gameplay and the graphics style, but criticizing the game's short length. I personally prefer the Pulstar and Blazing Star series myself, but this one was also a very competent attempt. I would give it around an 8 out of 10. Another game that was very highly recommended that I include in this review was Twinkle Star Sprites. Unlike other scrolling shooter video games, this one provides a twist by making it a competitive game. Whereas you go through stages, the amount of enemies you defeat will determine obstacles sent to your opponents, and vice versa. And out of all the games I've mentioned in the scrolling shooter genre, I think this one stands out as being the most unique, mainly due to that gameplay style. And unlike other scrolling shooters, I would say this one is a must to play 2-player, as I think it provided endless amounts of fun. Playing this game in single player is definitely not as fun, kinda like playing Puyo Puyo as one player. This is the first time I've ever played a competitive shooter fighting game like this, and I have to say I was very well hooked on it for quite a while. And although I'd give it about a 7 out of 10, I definitely feel like it's one that everyone should experience, especially if they're fans of the shooting genre. And then that brings me to Viewpoint, which is an isometric scrolling shooter video game developed by ACOM and originally released in 1992 by Sammy and SNK for the Neo Geo. To describe how this game plays, I would say it's definitely inspired by Sega's Zaxxon, but also taking inspiration from games like Xevious and R-Type. From this standpoint, the game is definitely unique, but it offers a style of gameplay I think is much more dated than the other scrolling shooters. As with many scrolling shooters, you would expect that a lot of it is memorization of where enemies are going to spawn and where things are at, but that is turned up to an extreme I think in this game that really kept me from enjoying it to its full potential. Other reviews of this game have been a lot more kind, giving it close to a 10 out of 10 score when it first released, but mellowing out to around a 7.5 out of 10 in more recent reviews. And for me, it comes down to a personal preference of I don't really care for the isometric perspective, and that really kept me from enjoying this game as much as other people might. So even though I'd recommend this game as something unique to try, especially if you're tired of just the vertically or horizontally scrolling shooter games, I would give it around a 5 out of 10. The rest of these games are sadly only available on the MVS. However, using a proper converter, you can play these on your AES as well. Taking a look at Captain Tamade, I think the most unique thing about this game is just how you play it, as you're playing basically as a tomato that's going through with your fists and punching different enemies. Definitely a unique title that I would probably try out in an arcade, but didn't really offer me much more than a quick playthrough experience just to see what it was like. Prehistoric Isle 2 was co-developed by Soros and Yumkobo, both of which I have mentioned previously with other games in this review. In this game, you basically control helicopters to take down dinosaurs, and it's kind of a standard shoot-'em-up fare, but nothing really stands out about this one. Strikers 1945 Plus immediately caught my attention with that opening FMV cutscene, but overall disappointed when it came to the gameplay. It's really just as generic as could possibly be with a scrolling shooter. It can be fun, but overall I did feel it to be very generic. Zedblade is another one that didn't really stand out to me as anything other than, like I said, a generic scrolling shooter. That didn't really screw it up, but again, nothing that stood out to me to make it worth recommending to anyone over any of the other games on this list. Overall, my thoughts on the run-and-gun and scrolling shooter video games that are on the Neo Geo are very positive. But I will add that this is a purely nostalgic point of view. I remember playing games mostly like what was on the Neo Geo, mainly in arcades, and almost always being disappointed at their home ports. Seeing them on the actual arcade hardware they were designed to run for in the 1990s is a huge special treat that I am definitely glad to relive on this system. Most of these games are very fast and have a lot of moving objects on screen at once, and the Neo Geo powers through it like a champ. There were a few instances where I noticed that the game slowed down a lot, but I noticed that in titles where it really seemed like they were trying to get more out of the Neo Geo than it was capable of. But if I remember correctly, that was only from a couple games in the later parts of the 1990s, where the Neo Geo was trying to punch above its weight class by staying relevant in an era that would be quickly dominated by 3D-based games. Personal favorites that I've mentioned in this video have been Blazing Star and Pulstar, Twinkle Star Sprites, one of the launch titles, Ghost Pilots, was one of my first games I plugged into the Neo Geo and provided a very good experience. But above all else, Metal Slug still stands at the top of this genre, being my favorite of the shooting games on the system. And even though I played through this series several times, it really doesn't seem to get old for me. It's just a game that I can easily jump back into, play through a couple levels, relive the nostalgia, and I can come back to it again in a couple weeks and be just as thrilled with it. Shock Troopers and Ninja Commando were also two games that I was unexpectedly surprised by. I did notice it was either Shock Troopers or Shock Troopers 2 that had the slowdown issue I had mentioned before, but it didn't really bog down the gameplay. It was still fun to play despite the slowdown. The biggest warning I have for those of you that may not be fans of the scrolling shooter video game genre is that these are all designed to be first and foremost arcade games. That means in each game, somewhere along the line, you're going to encounter an enemy or a boss that was designed to drain your quarters. And this results in a lot of what seems like unfair deaths, but of course on multiple playthroughs you get to master it and you're able to eventually overcome it. And in fact, I think that's really the only criticism I have of any of these games is that they are designed to be shorter arcade game playthroughs. I don't think there's any game on this list that would take you a very long time to complete, definitely nothing close to what modern games can accomplish. But it all comes back down to the core gameplay just being solid and addicting that I think makes these titles enjoyable despite the short length. That said, I do want to know down in the comments below, what are your favorite shooters that are on the Neo Geo? Are there any that you have played, any of them you haven't that look interesting? Also let me know if you agree or disagree with some of the opinions I've expressed about these games. I really look forward to seeing what your experience has been. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.